You're listening to Liminal Phames. I'm Nathan, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host, Darren King, also known as ExoAcademian. Darren King, you have recently returned from the Archives of the Impossible. I'm very eager to hear about how that went. I know you have a lot to say about it. It sounded great, what you relayed to me earlier, but I also want to talk about how you've been, other than traveling to that conference, and catch up a little bit with where you are in the mountains and just kind of what's going on generally in your life. Before we jump into this episode, we got a lot of territory to cover here. It's been pretty busy in the UFO topic over the last week and a half or so. So a lot of hot things to go through. But before we get into those discussion points, fill me in. What's been going on with you? And then tell me a little bit about Archives. I'm curious to hear about it.
Yeah, it's been a busy time, but a really good time, a really fruitful time. I've been pretty busy just because when I'm going to be gone for a week at the conference, because I was gone for a full week, I have to kind of plan ahead of time with my coaching clients, with the classes, with recording 2 podcast episodes in 1 week. So I have one pre-recorded for the weekend when I'm at the archives. So that was a busy final week beforehand. And then I flew out to Houston to go to the archives. I think it's like the 4th time I've been to Houston in 2 years. So it feels like a home away from home to some degree. And I have kind of roots there, which is interesting. And the experience at the archives was really great. Now, it's quite a juxtaposition with my usual life, though, right? Because I live in this cabin in the woods, and everyone I speak to is through Zoom, basically, or phone, through Signal or something. So I really don't know anybody in the town that I live in, other than people I might smile at the gym kind of thing. So going to this one place, this one location at the Rice campus, and suddenly having all these people that I know, as well as many people that know me that I don't necessarily know, that come up to me, which was great, really wonderful experience. It's a lot. And I'm not sure about you, but I would say on the introverted to extroverted spectrum, I'm sort of at the 30% level kind of thing, a bit more introverted than extroverted. So I did kind of hit my socialization limit a couple of times and had to go somewhere else in campus just to recover and recharge. But overall, it was a really amazing experience. My other podcast host, Janice from Event Horizon, was there. So that was the first time we met in person. Many people are surprised by that because they like our rapport. They assume we've known each other for years. But as I said to you before we started recording, pretty much all of my closest friends and associates I've known for less than 5 years. So I have an unusual life that way. But it's great to connect with her and many other friends and people that I know and care about. And then the conference itself was, I think, a really interesting mix of kind of hard science and people coming out of the military sharing their experience, and then also more of a philosophical approach. So the first day and a half, we had people like Tim Gallaudet and Gary Nolan speaking, Kevin Knuth and Wes Waters from the Galileo Project. So that was more the hard science kind of approach. And then in the last day of the conference, that's when I spoke and was part of this ethics of contact panel, which I think went really well. I think each of our talks kind of complemented each other. And we sort of expanded the conversation, very Liminal Phames style, to think about the broader context of who we are, what reality is, and how that relates to this question around UFOs and NHI. Really liked the responses from the audience. It was obviously a very pro-experiencer audience. So that was nice to be there and be part of that. Had many people come up to me and made a lot of new connections. Overall, a great week away. It was an amazing experience.
Yeah, it sounds really incredible. I guarantee I'm going to get there eventually. This year I couldn't make it, but hopefully next year it would be great to all get there together, and it'd be fun. I really still think we need to do some sort of Liminal Phames, Event Horizon, Point of Convergence, mashup podcast, at least one episode. I think that would be really cool. And to do it in person would be even better. So maybe we can put that on our wish list for next year. That would be very exciting. As far as things that have been happening in my world, it's been just very, very busy. First quarter of the year is very busy for me. It's starting to get a little bit less so, which is nice. I've had a lot going on the last 3 weeks. I've reached the age, a little TMI here, but I've reached the age now where I've had a colonoscopy. So I had that done the last 3 weeks, so that was very exciting. Get your colonoscopy, folks. So anyway, that was good. But, I've been keeping up with the UFO stuff kind of from the sidelines. I tend to, right now, I've been a lot less active in the social media space more so just observing, taking in the content, keeping up with the news. Of course, there's a lot happening in U.S. politics, which I pay a little bit of attention to. I think it's hard not to pay attention to some of that stuff and what's going on there, and of course how it affects the world. So it's been quite busy, in my neck of the woods. I am curious though, just to kind of come back to you on archives. Would you say it's now kind of really hitting its stride? It's been going through this a few times, and the comment that you made about there being a pretty strong experiencer presence there is interesting to me, because I think that speaks one to the environment, the context that they've been able to create for that conference, where people feel comfortable as an experiencer coming to get content that is presented in kind of a very academic light in an academic institution affiliation, but they're bringing a very, what some would say, a very subjective, very personal thing, and they feel comfortable being there and absorbing that content and also sharing their experiences, which I think is really profound and powerful, and a testimony to the work that many have done under Jeff Kripal's leadership and others to create a place and a space where all people feel welcome, and we're kind of trying to advance this subject from different angles of attack, if you will. So I wonder if you could speak to that. Do you think that that's a fair assessment? And what do you sort of look forward to for next year's conference, or other things that you may be aware of that Archives is working to do in the coming year?
Yeah, I'm really happy to be associated with Archives of the Impossible, and the fact that GME and Archives kind of have a partnership, I think, is wonderful. It's a great fit. It's a really natural fit, I think. Obviously, a lot of this comes down to the legacy of Jeff Kripal, who's a good friend of mine. Jeff is such an amiable person when you're around him, so friendly and warm, and he just naturally is able to create the safe environment. And for an academic, he really has pursued some pretty interesting outlier topics. And he not only has pursued them, but he's really challenged academia to get off its high horse and admit its own prejudice when it thinks about some of these topics. So the notion of the impossible is, of course, a theme that he's had going for several books now, and then evolved into the Archives of the Impossible. But that's actually expanded even more so recently, because Rice University is so happy with what Jeff has done, what Archives has represented, and how it kind of has carved out this niche like no other university in the world, that now it's becoming the center for the impossible. So an entire center is going to be at Rice now, which means they get a lot more funding from Rice. They get a lot more support from Rice. They get their marketing team, public relations team. It's basically Rice's rubber stamping and saying, we really believe in this project. We want to expand it. We want Rice to be known for this. So again, for a mostly privately funded university in Texas, this is quite an outlier, right? Not just the national political climate right now, but even within Texas is quite an outlier. So it's beautiful to see. And absolutely, when I mentioned in my talk that experiencers are central to this conversation, this huge cheer and clapping went up in the audience. So it's very much a pro-experiencer kind of crowd. And I just, again, really applaud my colleague and friend Karen Austin, who was the person who organized a lot of the conference and has been the project manager for Archives, as well as being the executive director for GEMI. She spent many, many long hours putting this together. It's painstaking work to organize a conference like this, which, to your point, by the way, I think it's going to be 2 years before the next one happens. This one was also a 2-year gap. The last one, which I was also at, was 2023, because it is a lot of work. But exciting things are happening there, and I'm excited about what they're expanding into as well.
That's great. Yeah, really encouraging. And, there are a lot of avenues that are being pursued right now to try to bring more attention and more elevate the quality of the inquiry into the phenomena. We've got Archives that is happening. We've got the Soul Foundation also trying to take a very academic approach. We've got the Galileo Project, which of course has been around for quite some time, also taking a more objective view of trying to collect data. And of course, we've got recently Skywatchers. We've got the work that they're doing, led by Jake Barber. Gary Nolan's involved with that as well, as many others. And they just released their second episode. I guess I forget that they're calling them episodes, but their second episode was just released this week, and a lot of attention was given to that. And the production value is really, really strong, continuing in the same vein from where they started from the last episode. And they presented some really interesting data, I would say, some really interesting information for the community to digest. And clearly they're still working to do more. But they introduced kind of their taxonomy of different quote unquote craft that they might be seeing in the sky. They talked about how they're interacting with the craft, maybe means by which they are summoning them, although I think they're moving away from using that term. So maybe not summoning, but calling them into or inviting them into that space. So we were familiar with what they've done before with when it comes to psionics and introduction of that term in the kind of more common vernacular now. And then we've also got this new sort of artificial device that they refer to as the dog whistle. We can kind of debate whether that's a good name for it or not. But apparently that's something that they use. They've divulged exactly the technical specifications of what that is. But it does seemingly, according to them, every time they use this, they turn it on, that they get sightings. They get sightings of craft, at least a craft that falls within this taxonomy of objects that they have begun to catalog. And so, one, I want to say I applaud them for the effort that they've done with that in creating that attempt at cataloging these types of objects. I think that's really important. I think a lot of folks who maybe were on the fence about this will be really enticed by this effort, because it is a very objective, scientific approach to try to get more evidence. Now, you could also say some of them might be a little wary of the psionic component of it, because that's certainly more in the woo-woo territory. But maybe the combination here is something that would really get folks interested, and in folks who might be on the fence when it comes to the woo might be more open-minded about it if it's paired with this very scientifically rigorous type of approach in capturing this evidence. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that release, and talk a little bit about the craft, the kind of objects that they were able to spot, and let's talk too about the methodology. I think that's a good approach that they're using to try to gain this information.
Yeah, I think we'll go back and forth on this because there's numerous nuances to get into. Interestingly and relevantly, Gary Nolan in his talk at Archives of the Impossible actually brought up Skywatcher because, of course, he's involved in it. And he had mentioned that just a couple days previous to the conference, he had been out there gathering data with them. And he mentioned that they had a sighting that, in addition, they had corroborating evidence with different sensors. And his point was, regardless of whether or not you claim that's a UFO or whatever you try to claim it is, it's something because it's showing up not just in vision, but also on sensor data. And so his challenge to the scientific community was, listen, I'm not trying to argue this is a UFO or trying to convince you, but it is your task to explain this observation. This is data. Just tell us what you think of this data. How do you make sense of it? Just ignoring the data is not scientific, right? So I thought it was a point well made. And yes, I think both you and I applaud that aspect, that they're trying to bring scientific rigor and trying to move the conversation forward by finding evidence that would convince even some of the skeptics. Now, I think you and I would both agree that so far, 2 episodes in, they haven't reached that threshold. We don't hear Mick West coming around and saying, okay, I'm sorry I was wrong. You got me convinced. In fact, he came out and said, this could be balloons from what I'm seeing. Now, there's numerous elements to get to here. So one thing that occurs to me is in their description in the taxonomy, they use the word craft a couple of times. I think that's an open question. Is this a craft? Is this an object? Is this a vehicle? Is it a life form? Is it biological? Is it both? Right? Is it a biological craft? This seems to be coming up more and more in the conversation. You and I have talked about this. I have been reading even some more dated UFO books, including one about the coming of the Space Brothers that was like the early part of the 20th century. And even then, to my surprise, there were people that talked about coming across craft that almost seemed alive to them. So it's not just a new thing. It goes back a ways, actually. But when you actually look at the footage they capture, which admittedly is pretty blurry, right? It's pretty distant. And there's morphing going on. There's light effects going on. So it's hard to tell when it's an artifact of a light effect versus the craft itself. That's interesting. And again, this question of what exactly are we looking at, right? I think about when James Lukatsky famously got to look at that one craft that had been captured, right? That was one of the big revelations in that book. He walked inside, didn't see any propulsion mechanism, didn't see any navigation system. And he said, this prompts the question, what exactly are we looking at? Could this be a time machine? Fascinating. And I have to have that same question when I look at these different objects. Now, the one that's the Tic Tac, of course, very familiar to us, though there were some nuances there, but we'll get to a little bit later. But the other ones, I'm not sure what I'm looking at. And it's interesting, and I was saying this to you before we started recording, when we think about traditional ufology, if there is such a thing, we usually think about flying saucers, black triangles, that kind of thing. But these things that seem to be morphing, changing shape, seem to be, in the manta ray case, they suggest maybe even flapping wings or folding wings in. Again, suggests something more than just this rigid craft structure. I'll stop there for now. There's things I want to get into with the dog whistle and all that, but let me get your initial impressions of that second episode, what you thought it demonstrated and what you thought remains an open question.
Yeah, it's certainly curious, and I was very interested in the technology that they were using and the individuals that they brought who discussed that technology. It was also mentioned they had been gathering data for 5 years, which was quite surprising to me, and I think that raises some other questions we don't necessarily have to get into at the moment. But it's curious that time period. It's a pretty long time to be gathering evidence and information. Kind of begs the question, what other kind of evidence do they might have that may just not have made the quality of footage that they assembled for this episode? Will that evidence get released? It would be very interesting because they could be sitting on some really profound stuff, right? For all we know, I don't know. Notably absent from the craft, the list of craft, saucers, right? Triangles, some of the classic objects that we're used to, hearing about in the lore were not present in their taxonomy. They did speak to that a little bit. They said, well, we haven't seen them. When we do, then we'll have some data we can, use to start talking about them and creating new classes for those objects. But until we do, we're not going to just, put them on the board just for the sake of putting them on the board. I think that's a fair approach. I think it is good for them to wait and see if they can get those kinds of objects to appear. But it does beg the question, what is the connection between the kinds of techniques that Skywatcher is using and the objects that are appearing as opposed to the objects that are not appearing? And so those objects that don't appear, are they not as enticed by these techniques? Do they not respond to them in any way? What kind of connection, what kind of piloting is involved with those craft? I mean, these are a lot of very open-ended questions I don't have answers to, but certainly interesting to think about as we're going to continue following their efforts. The 8-gon, of course, is another craft that we've been introduced to recently that was not present in their list of classes, so that's certainly interesting. And I guess the proximity of these objects to the observation teams. They do seem to be still pretty high up in the atmosphere, although there was mention that there were at least a couple of instances where they could see these objects with the naked eye, which I thought was kind of cool. But, you and I both know that if you're just outside looking up at the sky, an airplane in the sky on a bright day from far away can look a lot like a Tic Tac, right? So if you've got some really quality camera equipment that you can get a solid zoom, you should be able to get some pretty good resolution on that object. And the community seems to be responding positively to Skywatcher's call for additional volunteers with that kind of camera knowledge. So I think that's great. It's just a sign that they're trying to be public. They're trying to be transparent. They're trying to gather more folks to be engaged in the effort. Time will tell, though. I'm giving them a lot of time to kind of figure things out. I really, really want them to succeed in capturing more evidence that can, I think, really convince people, right? I mean, I've said before that once we get that Mick West serves a very valuable function in the community, and once Mick West agrees that we, in fact, have something anomalous, then that tells you we're at a tipping point. And I think that's true. It's really hard to get that person on board, but if we've got that kind of evidence that would swing them, then to me it would be very, very convincing, and that would be a sign of positive momentum. So all very good things. I'm really heartened by the fact that they engage with the community regularly. They seem to be, kind of out, and they've got, social media profiles. They respond to people. All that stuff seems good. I do find it interesting. Our community is so reactionary, right? We're so hungry for this information, this kind of content, that as soon as it drops, there's just a flurry of takes on it, right? There's positive takes, negative takes, takes before the episode even was released, the kind of the pre-take on what it's going to be like. And that can be kind of off-putting in some ways, because I prefer much more of a wait and see approach, and let's take time to evaluate. Let's not lean too hard on one conclusion over another, and let's kind of give them time to develop some results. So we'll see. I'm encouraged, but we'll see where it goes. And I'm curious to see how frequently we'll be getting these drops, right? How often will we get one of these episodes that will provide more content? So a lot of open questions here, but a good start, I think.
Yeah, well said. And I think a couple of the points I'd like to make. One is that even though they are established in this taxonomy, we should be clear that most of these types have been seen before. In fact, somebody pointed out, for instance, that the jellyfish, while that is different than the one that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp presented, which seemed a bit more metallic or mechanical, this feels more like morphing and alive and biological or something. Again, organic. What words do we use here to describe it? But there, of course, is a famous case of a crop circle that looks like a jellyfish. So again, is that the same intelligence trying to say, this is us? Interesting thoughts there. We also have claims that, again, it's somewhat ambiguous, but they seem to suggest sometimes two of these things would show up, and they got the sense, although not sure how much detail they went into, that one might be protecting them from the other one, that maybe one was malevolent or nefarious, and the one was just making sure they weren't going to do anything untoward towards the group that was studying this. That's fascinating. I would love to know more details, why they came to that conclusion. Were the psionic assets picking up energy psychically about that? That's fascinating. We also have, like you mentioned, the dog whistle. Some people have come forward and said that's an unfortunate name, feels very anthropocentric. And, it kind of, again, makes some assumptions, right? So we assume we do this, it comes, right? We think of Pavlov's dogs, the famous case, right? I remember studying in psychology. But they might be humoring us for all we know, right? They might be actually saying, we'll let them believe this is happening because we're trying to teach them something, this greater concept. And I would say the more distance there is in intelligence and sophistication between one kind of life form and another, the less able you are to make those leaps and assumptions. I think you should be very, very cautious about that. It is fascinating that they've now talked about having two approaches, right? So they have the psionic assets that use this kind of psychic connection that Jake Barber described in some of his earlier interviews. But now we have this additional technology that whenever they employ it, like you say, it seems to make these things show up. Now, to your point about earlier about we both touched on how triangles and saucers are not seen. And these things seem, maybe you could argue, more organic. I'll go again, these terms kind of collapse because we don't know what the parameters are here. But maybe this is like, a life form that hears a certain sound and thinks it's some sort of prey. And so it shows up because it somehow mimics that prey. Could be that for all we know. We don't know what degree of intelligence is involved here. This summoning, or, we're going to later on talk about Steven Greer. He was very quick to say, we don't use that term. That's kind of offensive. We're inviting. So dog whistle certainly seems to lean more towards the connotation of summoning than inviting. So really interesting to watch, not just the techniques we employ, but how we interpret what is happening, when I think that's an open question. Another piece I want to bring up that I'd love to get your take on too, they did mention one time that they sent a helicopter out to get a closer look at one of these things. And at one point, the helicopter was impeded. It was held in place. It couldn't move forward or back. They were applying the usual pressure. It wasn't working. So it seemed like that was evidence of one of these objects actually doing some of what we've heard been talked about in military circles, where they can interfere with the operation of craft. So what do you think about that? Does that say something to you that you think is interesting that takes us somewhere else, or does that remain ambiguous in your mind?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's something I forgot there. That was really interesting, right? That because you had experienced helicopter pilots. There was I forget the gentleman's name on the episode who attested to this, but he's like, I've never experienced anything like this before. I mean, that's compelling. Obviously, we want more data. I hear the data people already saying, that's just a trust me, bro claim. I get it, fair. Hopefully, we do get that data. That would be alarming, I would think, if you're a pilot who should have command of that vehicle and it's not able to do what you are asking it to do, and you've got a lot of flight experience. Like, that would be pretty concerning. It reminds me of some of the episodes from Skinwalker Ranch where they had similar kinds of interactive behavior with the helicopter, and not quite that freezing in the sky situation, but certainly weird interactions where like the radar was giving strange returns. There are weird things happening with the craft. So it's certainly interesting. The one thing I wanted to bring up that I actually hadn't thought about at all till I was listening to your reactions there, and that's a different angle, a whole different angle to some of this. And it reminds me of the kinds of apports that appear in medium seances, right? So some of these objects, they kind of have an ectoplasmic looking, appearance. And I'm not as experienced or as well read in that side of phenomenal experience, but it does remind me of some of those same kinds of things. And if you think about like the skull experiment, where you've got human beings getting together with an intention to see something, and they're having that shared intentionality, and craft appears. Well, I mean, who's to say that the craft isn't being like generated from that intentionality, and the kind of appearance that it takes on is amorphous, just like an ectoplasmic, manifestation might be in a seance, right? So again, I don't know where this thought came from, but it's certainly interesting to pursue that line of inquiry. And it's just a matter of scale, right? So we've got, we don't think of that as a possibility because we only think of ectoplasm in the context of a small group, dimly lit room. It's a very small microscopic kind of setting. But I think there was that, I don't know if it was the skull experiment or another one, where they had like the miniature UFO that apparently appeared in the room and, traveled around. So again, very interesting, the connection between human consciousness and the appearance of these objects.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I had a couple of interesting experiences at the Archives conference related to what you're talking about, because I believe, if I remember correctly, that actually Gary Nolan brought up apports in his talk. And also, I was involved in this meeting that was kind of a big tent conversation amongst different UFO organizations, as well as some of the people involved in the government lobbying efforts as well, people would recognize the names. And what I was surprised by was that we got into that. We talked about tulpas and egregores. I kind of brought that up towards the end of the day because my colleague, Elliot, who teaches at the University of Texas, Austin, who's involved in the AI aspect of the metadata project, brought up cases where, like you're describing, where collective human consciousness was actually able to not only manifest something, but then that thing takes on a kind of autonomous nature and carries on by itself for a period of time. So I remember us talking about this in this meeting, and some of these guys, maybe more on the government side, were scratching their heads like, so is that NHI? What is that? And we're saying, no, it's an extension of human consciousness. Again, in a consciousness first kind of reality frame, that's not hard to reckon with. But if you're coming from a more traditional frame, that might be really difficult to reckon with. So I think that is fascinating. And yeah, you could definitely at least argue that you've got all this scientific gear, you've got all this data gathering, you've got all these resources, money investment. That's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is that that's a lot of shared intention. It's a shared coherent field of intention. Could that perhaps manifest some of these things? Could this be an extension of human consciousness? I think it's probably more than that, but I think, you do well to bring that up, because we have to be quick, again, to not only assume what we think it is, but also what we're, clear about what it's not, because it might be something beyond what we're assuming. Like if you're going out, you've used this analogy many times, and all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. You're looking for UAP, this NHI operated or somehow remotely controlled objects, vehicles, representing the sophistication, the technology of non-human intelligence, and something manifests, you go, aha, jackpot. But is that what it is? Because our intention, our consciousness, especially when it's directed, when it's coherent, can produce these things. It's been proven historically. So I think it's a fair point. All right, so let me jump into some of the descriptions of the classes, because this is really interesting, right? So on their website, you can go and look at this. They covered this in the episode, right? So there's 9 observed UAP classes. And to your point, it's not that they only saw these, but they say that these categories represent the most consistently observed patterns in UAP behavior, shape, and sensor signature across multiple collection efforts. So obviously they're leaning on ones they don't just have sightings of, but they have other data to back it up and corroborate. And they're also pointing out this is a living taxonomy. And what they mean by that is that this will probably evolve as they have more data. They fully expect that. They're not expecting us to take this as the golden truth, the gospel on these topics. So the first one is the tetra, really interesting tetrahedron-shaped UAP, which tumbles on multiple axes while on a stable flight path. Often appears in groups of 3 to 20 plus. What is that, Nathan? What's your take on that? And if you saw that in the sky, 20 of them at a time.
Yeah, they didn't. I mean, they introduced that, but they certainly didn't show. I didn't recall seeing anyway that many objects in some footage that they had. So very fascinating. Would love to see that content. If that's happening in broad daylight, that would be highly intriguing. Right? What exactly is that? I think people would be very hungry to digest that information. So, yeah, I'm very intrigued. We've heard of similar kinds of objects that are maybe angular. Cubes come to mind. The spheres within cubes, that may tumble or have different kinds of erratic motion, and they may also appear in swarms or formations. So yeah, that would be interesting to see more evidence of that. I mean, they're opening a door to a lot of questions, and I think that's great. There's a broad canvas that they're using here, and that's very positive. Can they keep the pace going? That's what I'm really interested in. So yeah, very, very interesting that it didn't present, I think clear evidence of that, but it's a class that apparently they have enough evidence for to list it in their taxonomy.
Right, and just to make this point again, on whether or not it's a made manufactured thing versus being organic and biological, of course, we know sometimes flocks of birds can appear together. And amazingly, again, this is part of the miracle of nature, the birds, sometimes even in dozens of them, seem to be able to be in coordination in how they're flowing and flying. And some people have suggested this is quantum microtubules in the brains of the birds, tapping into the magnetic nature of the earth. Really fascinating stuff. So although there are 20 plus sometimes, that still holds open the question, is this organic, is this biological, or is this actually manufactured craft? Again, or maybe some blend of the two. All right, the next one I'm going to get into, I'm going to save the most interesting one for last maybe, so we can transition to our next topic. But the next one I'm going to discuss is class 3, which is called, the very colorful term, the blob. So the blob is an orb-shaped UAP that exhibits pulsing internal light, horizontal oscillation, and erratic point-to-point movement. Notice that, erratic point-to-point. So that seems to be anomalous flight behavior there. It's capable of extreme speed and rapid flare-driven expansion, observed exclusively as singletons. So unlike the tetra that can sometimes appear 20 plus, this one always appears one on its own apparently. So any particular observations about that one before I move on to the next one?
Well, just to make the point that I think if you're a data person, you really want to see the collection of data that they have to come to those conclusions to frame that kind of object in this specific, unique class. So I would assume that it takes more than one observation of a craft like this, of an object like this, to place it into its own classification. And I would assume you've got to have more than one instance of that behavior that you're talking about to also do the same, right? So it does beg the question: what evidence do they have that they use to come to this conclusion? How will they share that evidence? What form does it take? I'm sure it's tons and tons of gigabytes, if not more, information that people have to sift through. But truly intriguing if that's kind of the behavior that they're seeing, and I think people want to see that, right? So if you've got that, if you've collected that, people really want to dive into that, and how can we crowdsource the community to get some answers there?
Yeah, absolutely. right, this next one is interesting. And by the way, just as a quick aside, when you mentioned the tetra, and we've seen things like that, I also thought about, again, Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp's footage of the things that look like triangles, but apparently live, they were more like pyramids. So similar kind of shape there, right? All right, the next one is interesting because it only shows up on infrared. And this is called the beam. So this is a class 4 called the beam. It's an IR-only orb-shaped UAP. Orbs show up over and over again, right? This shape. An orb-shaped UAP that vibrates while in a stable flight path. It hovers in place for hours at a time, seen in pairs. So first we had the tetra that can be in 20 plus. Then we had the blob that always appears alone. And then we have the beam, which only shows up on infrared and always in pairs, apparently, or at least often in pairs. All right, manta ray is next. This one I found pretty fascinating. So the manta ray shaped UAP that tumbles on multiple axes, rarely seen. So this is interesting that they still included it here because to your point, you would think they would at least have to have multiple sightings to even feel confident or semi-confident about this, in their term, preliminary classification. So it's rarely seen, but when it is seen, it's often observed in proximity to Tic Tacs. So what's your take on the manta ray?
Yeah, that is an interesting morphology, and I think a cool name that they chose for that. It does take you away from anything that's super angular. It's kind of more organic. It evokes that organic being type, movement that you alluded to earlier. Yeah, intriguing. I mean, they had some footage of that. You could tell that the way the light was refracting off the surfaces as it was sort of shifting, that you could potentially see that it was undulating or flapping, a kind of flapping. But we know lots of things that flap in the sky, right? But the way that you talked about how it's really seen, it just begs the question: what's going on there? How can we get more magnification on that? Does it behave in other ways that might resemble something organic rather than manufactured? So that would be interesting too, because we've often talked about or heard about that there could be a whole sort of class of life forms that could exist in the atmosphere that we're just not familiar with, and that makes me think too that there could be some classes of atmospheric phenomena that we're not aware of. That could be reacting with the chemicals in the atmosphere and the amount of radiation that's in the atmosphere. There's a lot of various things that are up there. So maybe there's something like a ball lightning that we're just now kind of stumbling across. That would be interesting to discover.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, the next one was also one of my favorites. I thought it was really fascinating to look at. It's the Bright Star. So this is the class 6 Bright Star, which is a reflective tetrahedron-shaped UAP that oscillates horizontally, flashing light. The team has experienced sensor disruption apparently caused by directed energy. So that's fascinating because it begs the question, was that intentional? Is that indirect? Was this a sign of interaction? Was this potentially aggressive behavior? Sensor disruption in the presence of these bright star objects. Any takes on them?
Angels, man. I think that's the take. It's got to be angels. Yeah, I don't really know. That's also very intriguing. But it was the one that made me go, oh, I could see how someone might see that and think it might be more angelic in appearance, kind of the morphology that it has, or its bright star being something that's often, associated with angels. And again, I'm just using that term because it's used a lot in the community. I don't think it's an angel, but that is what it evokes for me.
For the record, Nathan has chimed in. Lucifer, the morning star, that's what it is. The morning star, Lucifer. Great. Nathan's chimed in with his take. We'll see if he's right. Okay, moving on now to the jellyfish. Now, this is fascinating. Like we said, this is not the same jellyfish that Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp have released footage of. This looks more organic than that. It looks like, or it's been known to have longer tentacles sometimes than others. It's a jellyfish-shaped UAP with a quote-unquote seeking head motion and trailing tentacles. So I guess that means it flies by the head first kind of thing. It exhibits a localized area effect on electronics, which is fascinating, independent of specific targeting or interaction with sensors. So the jellyfish certainly looks organic. It certainly makes you think about something biological. And like you pointed to, could be a plasma organism, could be some sort of organism that's been here all along. We just haven't been tracking it up until now. So what's your take on the jellyfish?
Yeah, very interesting. I'm hungry for more data because like every time you describe these, I'm like, well, how did they get that? How did they understand or come to that conclusion that this is what was happening? And the interaction with the electronics is very interesting. Like that's something they should have been able to document on either camera or through instrumentation. If they have that object and it appears and all of a sudden things like stop working, and there's a correlation there that's happening more than a few times, right? That's a strong correlation. Then that's kind of the data that I think we want to see. And the entire notion that these are organic life forms that might be, inhabiting the atmosphere and we're just kind of oblivious to them is really interesting. And why would they take a similar morphology to something that lives in the ocean? So that raises more questions about the ocean. We've often kind of wondered about what's going on with the ocean, how much of it do we really understand, and the life forms that live there, how many of them do we actually know about? Many, many questions follow.
Absolutely. And octopi are really interesting organisms. Many people have suggested they're almost like an alien unto themselves. All right, then we have a couple to get through before we land on a familiar one. So the first is called the Hornet. This is the class 8. This is a dual-body UAP with hanging tendrils and asynchronous rotation. A multi-part craft. Again, I think it's fascinating that they use that term. I think that's kind of ambiguous based on the data, but maybe they know more than they're letting out. Often purple, red, blue, and black coloration, and has a prominent tail that folds into a ball or extends into a stinger-like formation, hence the term hornet as a name. There's that, and let me just give one more, and then you can give me your take on both those. And that, of course, is one that's been familiar when we think about Skywatcher and Jake Barber, and that's the egg. An off-white, egg-shaped UAP, provisional class designation. So they're letting us know this is preliminary, don't hold us to this. No corroborated motion at this point, structure, or spectral data. So this is very limited data they have at this point, but enough to include it at least. So we have the egg and the hornet. Your takes on those two?
Yeah, we obviously have seen some footage of an egg, a retrieval of an egg-shaped object, so I think people might have expected to see more egg footage from Skywatcher, but nice to know that they've got it listed as one of their classes, and they're just hoping to collect more data on that object. So TBD on that one. The Hornet is interesting. It's sort of got qualities of the jellyfish. It has kind of organic motion to it as well. I can certainly see arguments that might say these are balloons. These are sort of balloons that are just tangled up with each other, but they're really deflated and they're just up in the atmosphere. So we want to see information about them. Like, are they traveling with the wind, against the wind? What kind of resolution do we have on these objects? And that assumes too that whatever they showed us is the best footage that they have for these things, which may or may not be true.
Right, and the last of the classes that they included in this initial list is one familiar to all of us, of course, and that is the Tic Tac, the class 2. So cylindrical UAP that hovers, elongates during stable flight. So this is interesting, right? This is something we have not heard before, I don't think. This notion that it's not just a stable, set in stone outer shell, but actually can elongate during stable flight and has an area effect on electronics and aircraft. This would fit with what we've heard about in 2004 even. This one is seen in groups of 1 to 3, interestingly. And like we mentioned earlier, often observed with the manta ray in proximity. So that begs the question, are they working together? Are they opponents that show up because they're trying to counter each other's movements or intentions or agenda? How does this change the way you think about Tic Tacs in general? Do you think this is even the same thing or maybe just a similar shape?
Yeah, I'm waiting for more information on that to answer that question. It surprised me that Tic Tac appeared, honestly, in their collection of objects here. I think I maybe mistakenly just associated Tic Tacs with the ocean, with water. So kind of seeing one over land is something that I wasn't expecting. Of course, the more I think about it, the more obvious it is that that's perfectly reasonable, that they could appear anywhere they might want one to appear. The elongating behavior of the object is very interesting. So how do they measure that performance behavior? How are they capturing that? I want answers to that question. And, Tic Tacs are kind of back, man. Tic Tacs they're in the conversation now. So it's interesting to kind of have that as a classification, bringing it back into the conversation in the community. And then they also appear in this week's sort of news cycle as well. Tic Tacs have come back in a big way.
Yeah, in fact, later on, we're going to talk about Steven Greer and his conversation with Jesse Michaels. And of course, he touched on the Tic Tac. And interestingly, of course, perhaps not surprisingly, based on his general take, he claimed that's a man-made object. That's one of ours. He claims that we've had these for a long time. But of course, speaking of Tic Tacs, Nathan, recently we heard from, again, Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp. They talked about and released footage of a Tic Tac object, again, much more recent though. This was from 2023. So what do you remember about what they said about when this happened, where it happened, what was seen, and what do you take of that in terms of what this means for the Tic Tac, its origin, its purpose, that kind of thing?
Yeah, this was really interesting footage, clearer footage, quite frankly, than the Tic Tac footage we have from way back when. And of course, as you mentioned, much more recent footage of the object. It occurred off the coast of California, so a similar kind of training area that the U.S. Navy and its resources operate in. And if I remember correctly, I think it was Tim Gallaudet who said that the individuals that brought this forward felt comfortable bringing it forward following his testimony in Congress. And that was, from his perspective, reinforcing this notion that it's good for him to talk about this publicly, because it does lead to this kind of disclosure happening from people that are close to these experiences. Corbell has kept this a little bit close to the vest. Honestly, if you think about how Jeremy typically releases content, there's a bit of a build up to it. There's kind of like a hype cycle that he goes through. And this one, I mean, maybe I just wasn't paying attention, folks, and I can see that's very possible, but it felt like it just hit. It was just like, boom, here's the Tic Tac footage, and it's some of the more compelling footage that he's presented over the last several years, and he wasn't spinning it in a fantastical way. It was like, just let it speak for itself, and I found that to be interesting and different. He's also kind of alluded to after the fact that there's more data related to this, that he has more information about the object, or he has seen more footage, or he has something else. I don't know if we're going to get to see that, but that was certainly the subtext from some of his comments following the release of this footage. I mean, I think it's really fascinating. I don't know enough about the instrumentation, the way that the camera behaves and tracks the object to fully piece together how it's acting in the atmosphere. But we've heard that it may have come out of the water or been tracked coming out of the water at some point, which aligns a lot with other things we've heard about the Tic Tac from the Nimitz incident. So very interesting content, and hopefully along the lines of other content that is released similar to it, we'll see further revelations and more folks willing to share similar kinds of encounters. Because what we've been told, and maybe we haven't seen as much of, we've been told this is happening all the time. Corbell says this quite a lot. This is stuff that's happening all the time in our training ranges, and we just don't ever get to see footage of it. We don't ever get to hear testimony of it because it's been classified. So how often is this happening, and what the heck is this thing? It certainly was very clearly Tic Tac shaped. So didn't look like a plane, didn't look like a ball. What the heck was that thing? Really interesting.
Yeah, and by the way, I think this is a good time to announce that for those of you who are growing tired of the nuance, we're going to start a new podcast. It's much more about sensational headlines, shocking claims. It's going to be called Hype Cycle. It's going to start next month. And of course, I'm being completely humorous here. Don't follow us up for that. But, you brought up Tim Gallaudet. I got to interact with him a bit at the conference and before the conference. And yeah, in his presentation, he talked about how it's been a privilege of his that since he's come out, he has different people from the service that will reach out to him because he's sort of like, blazed that trail. And because of their shared experience, if the person is who they say they are, it's pretty easy for him to vet them pretty quickly, whether or not they are who they say they are. They were seeing what they were seeing. He even talked about coming on as a kind of consultant for Richard Dolan's most recent book on USOs. And he was actually able to debunk one of the things. There was this kind of spiral coloring thing that was seen beneath the water. And it turns out that was actually a completely natural effect of these plankton. So this movement in the water that draws these things, and you see these colorful kind of bands coming out underneath the boat. So you can get the sense that some giant objects coming up close to the boat from beneath the ocean, but actually it's the movement of the boat that draws this plankton, creates this colorful effect. So he was actually able to debunk and say that was a completely natural effect that he's observed. He says it's amazing and beautiful to observe it, but totally natural. So yeah, it was interesting getting his take on those things. And like you said, I think it's noteworthy that I think Jeremy said that at first, the way that they identified these things is people saw with the naked eye them coming out of the water. And they were self-luminescent to some degree, which is why they could see them. So that's, of course, fascinating. And this is going to segue to our next topic, which is the drones, right? Because the drones themselves also, one of the more interesting tidbits was not just the fact that there's anomalous behavior and they don't seem to quite be conventional objects, even though they kind of resemble them, but they were also seen apparently coming out of the water before they came over the coast of New Jersey and whatnot. So this thing, right, this aspect about USOs, the size of the oceans, again, Tim talked about this. Somebody asked him at the conference, how much of the oceans have we mapped? And he said, like, very, very little. And specifically when you're talking about high definition mapping, right, he said, like, you can only go so far down and get a high definition rendering. Below that, it's very pixelated. So his point was there are massive parts we have not mapped. There could absolutely be things down there. There could be bases down there. He did bring up one other interesting tidbit where he said, you might remember this one time where people noticed this weird, huge sort of like oval shape on the ocean floor off the coast of Southern California. And people thought, alien base, for sure, it's got to be. Turns out that also was a natural formation, and he was able to talk about that. So it's fascinating to hear that he's able to explain away some of the more natural things with his robust understanding. At the same time, he's absolutely claiming things have been seen that are clearly not explainable. So fascinating. But as we transition to now the drones, we have also, again, the notion that they're coming out of the water. And since we last spoke, Nathan, about the drones, which was a while ago now, maybe the end of last year, time's flying here. But since then, Ross Coulthart's come out and claimed that he's seen evidence that convinces him that these are UAP. And I was surprised by the boldness of his claim, how much he seemed confident that this was the case. He based this on numerous things, including anomalous flight behavior, the fact that the signatures, the technical signatures don't match traditional aircraft, the fact that there were objects seen morphing in real time to the naked eye. So what's your take on the drones? And following up on where we left that off, what's your take on them now, a few months later?
Yeah, I mean, I have to admit, I've kind of let drones disappear from my own awareness and thinking about them, in part because I felt that the information about drones was really muddied by a misidentification. A lot of the things that like the media would show you, they kind of looked like airplanes, right? So, but you had really confusing or conflicting testimony from eyewitnesses that would say, I live within a flight path. I'm used to seeing airplanes all the time. What I saw was not an airplane. It behaved very differently from that. And so they were really angry in a way, feeling like they had been gaslit into like that they didn't see what they actually saw. So I had to kind of square that testimony with the little footage that we had of drones. And so letting that kind of fade off into my thinking, and then Ross coming back and saying, I've got new evidence, and I really think it was NHI. Now that I've seen this, like, just an interesting thing I wasn't expecting, right? So we could have let this sort of fade away. I think we can all agree the way that the drones situation was handled was absolutely very poorly. The responses we've gotten from the government have been inadequate at best, awful. Most people agree on that as well. And like a lot of things that have happened with this administration, and quite frankly, they're not unique in this regard in many ways. They have kind of given poor explanations and then just moved on to the next thing, or they've given it a little bit of lip service, but then just let it disappear. And because our news cycle is so fast now, people just they quickly forget about that entire thing. So really interesting that he's bringing it back up. Ross tends to have a kind of a method to his madness, at least in my experience, that he doesn't bring stuff up just for fun. So it's interesting that he's raising this again, and will we be hearing more about drones perhaps in the next few weeks? I have no idea, but it would certainly be interesting if we were to get more detail on those sightings.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. It was interesting, right? It was noteworthy that he seemed to have the confidence he did. It was one thing to say, I think something might be going on here. It's something to say, it's one thing to say, I think some of these may be anomalous craft. We think about Jake Barber, or as Ross would say, Jake Baba, that these objects are seen dropping down from space, sometimes observing the drone. So at that point, the discussion seemed to be around the fact that most of these are conventional, but UAP do sometimes show up because they're always paying attention to what's going on. At that point, there was kind of the suggestion it might be a geopolitical kind of situation. But it's interesting, like you say, whatever Ross has come across, whatever information he's come across has convinced him that there's enough evidence for him to suggest this is not conventional. And to your point too, yes, both administrations now from two different parties have basically played the same game, right? They both come out and said this is basically prosaic, nothing to see here, which totally stands in opposition to those who really expected the Trump administration to champion disclosure and you would see transparency. That certainly hasn't happened here. And you can sort of palpably sense how Ross is frustrated and is demanding the administration really deal with this because it's something truly anomalous. Now, we're now going to go into our last half hour here, and we certainly can spend half an hour talking about this colorful figure. This is a person who's been central in ufology. You cannot talk about ufology without talking about this person. And of course, they are also a bit of a firebrand, and people have different opinions. Sometimes the opinions tend to move towards the extremes. People are either fully for him or fully against him. Some people say everything he says is gold. Some people say don't trust anything. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's full of ego. As is typical for Liminal Phames, we'll land somewhere in between. We'll try to pull out the nuggets that feel noteworthy and trustworthy, which ones we think have corroboration, which ones we think are maybe less credible. But let's talk about Dr. Steven Greer. And he was recently on a long-form interview with Jesse Michaels. Lots to get into. He talked about many topics over 3.5 hours, not surprisingly. And to Jesse's credit, he really asked him to go into some detail. So we got to hear aspects we haven't heard before. We saw sides of Greer that we maybe haven't seen before. But before we go into that list and the one-by-one kind of breakdown, what was your general take when you heard this interview was happening? And as you tuned in, what was your take on Greer based on what you knew of him before?
Well, the first thing I did is look at the length of the interview. And when I saw how long it was, I did a lot of stretching and I did some hydrating just to make sure I could get through it. Because Darren, it came out yesterday. We're recording this on a Friday. It came out Thursday evening, and I tried to blaze through it as fast as possible. So I went through it at a high speed and tried to get it done. It was a lot to consume. As I think texted you, it was a lot like listening to Grant Cameron. I mean, the guy is just full of information. He will talk nonstop at a very quick pace. And to Jesse's credit, as you say, he gave him a lot of room to speak and really talk about what he wanted to talk about. A lot of credit to Steven Greer for appearing on Jesse's podcast. Also, he had just had an emergency appendectomy like the day before, something like absolutely crazy. Emergency appendectomy, and he's just doing a podcast. So really interesting. And I've heard Steven Greer's content. I've heard a good bit of it. Unacknowledged, his documentary from a few years back was certainly played a big role in renewing my interest in this subject. And just recently, I participated on a review with Andy McGrillen of That UFO podcast. We discussed the 2001 Disclosure Project event that he had organized at the National Press Club in 2001. And all the testimony that he brought forward in that event. So that was interesting to see a younger Steven Greer from 24 years ago. At that point, he had already been doing this kind of stuff for at least 10 years or almost 10 years. And, he's still at it. The guy is, like a dog with a bone. He's not giving up. He's still also kind of beating a lot of the same drums that he was beating back then. And we'll talk a little bit about that, I'm sure, as we go through the talking points. But I found it fascinating. I mean, there's a lot of interesting content there in this interview. I think everybody should listen to it. No matter your take on Greer, it's worth listening to at least a good bit of it because it does give you I think a perspective on on ufology and the journey that we're in now from someone who's been at it for a really long time and really been kind of in the center of a lot of the activity. Greer is a lightning rod, and he's got people that do talk to him. He's got a mixture, I think personally, a mixture of quality information and some disinformation. He also brings to everything that he sort of absorbs his own, just like we all do, his own framework of interpretation. That interpretive grid, to me, is very obviously on display when Steven Greer is talking. So it's interesting to see that in long form, and I think people have a lot to chew on with this. I'm not sure necessarily what the best conclusions are. We'll get into some of those takes on some specific topics, but I'm glad that Jesse Michaels did it. I think it's well worth watching. Encourage people to see it, and then just come away with, is this reinforcing the perspective I have of Steven Greer, or does it change my mind? I think for me, it did reinforce a lot of the takes that I had before, but I also think that Greer deserves some credit. I mean, he's done quite a lot for this cause over the years, and he's been kind of that limitless source of energy to keep that enthusiasm going. And I think we need to give credit where credit is due.
Yeah, agreed. He definitely is a key figure, and we would not be where we are today without his work. And I think we, again, should be nuanced enough to champion that, to credit him for that, even if we can also be aware of some of his shortcomings. I noticed, and you and I talked about this, there are times where you can see him getting reactive, and that tells me something about someone's self-awareness, the degree of their maturity. We also hear, of course, when people disagree with Steven Greer that are in his orbit, they tend to not be in that orbit for very long. And then he tends to say things like, well, they were bought out or they got influenced by somebody else. Never really seems to acknowledge that maybe it had something to do with him and his behavior. So we recognize that. We see times where he looks reactive. One of the interesting things is when Jesse got a little bit bold and brought up the notion of the flares that were dropped. And of course, that the lore there is that some people accused Greer of literally arranging a dropping of flares so he could stage basically a CE5 event. And to my surprise, he stayed remarkably calm in his answer to that, which was surprising to me. I would expect more reactivity if it was as simple as some people have suggested. Now, another thing I would say about Greer's legacy and his history is that just as important, if not more important than what he's saying, is the credibility of the witnesses he brings along as part of the Disclosure Project. I think I'd highly recommend people go back and watch those videos. There's a treasure trove of videos of testimony going back decades now. And those people seem very credible much of the time, right? We think about someone like Michael Herrera who's come out. He's just one of many that seem to add pieces to this puzzle. So he does seem to do a good job of identifying people who are credible and bringing them forward and giving them a voice. And he even several times during this podcast said, if you're out there, you're a whistleblower, come talk to us. We're working on ways to make sure you're protected and whatnot. He also made the point, any program that you're in that you've signed an NDA around, it's an illegal project to begin with. You are not bound to that by law. Now, of course, different attorneys might have different interpretations of that, and people might want some safeguards in place from Congress before they do come forward, but I'm happy that he said that, and I do hope more people come forward. So let's jump into the first thing he said. This is a major component of the claims he makes. It's a major component of the worldview he holds and what he thinks is going on in totality. He claims that most UAPs seen today are actually human-engineered craft developed in black programs. They are not extraterrestrial. Not to say that some aren't, but he's saying the majority that are seen are human-engineered craft. And I think, Nathan, on this podcast more than ever before, I was surprised to how much he attested to the sophistication of these craft. Because I remember he used to talk about you could see rivets and dividing lines between some of the craft that were human-made. This time he talked about amazing sophistication that you really often can't tell them apart. Even discussing that there's been some organic creation of basically a synthetic gray that is being actually produced by these black programs. And that obviously ties in with his take on the abduction phenomenon, which we'll get into later. But let's tackle this thing about the idea that most craft being seen, when people get excited, they see something in the sky or they spot a black triangle, his claim is that 9 times out of 10, maybe more, that's going to be a human craft, not from the conventional military, but from this rogue secret government, basically deep state kind of operation. What's your take on that claim?
Well, I think it evokes the secret space program. It evokes aspects of the lore that are very controversial, very lightning rod types of subjects. I know you've touched on some of the secret space program topic in other podcasts, and I think it's certainly fascinating material to get into. And we've heard over the years a testimony that there is some truth to that claim. The reality for me is anything becomes possible if we have enough technological advancement and when that advancement occurs. So the best example I can give of this is if somewhere along the line we cracked space-time manipulation and are able to travel into the future somehow, then the kind of technology that would be potentially captured from the future, returned to the present or whatever, would appear like magic to us, right? So there's a lot of things that could happen if that becomes part of the equation. And according to Greer, it certainly is part of the equation, and we've speculated that it certainly is as well. So it's within the realm of possibility, I believe, if you're willing to take some of these claims at face value. I do think it was great that you brought up the fact that he historically has made claims that it's a man-made UFO because you can see the struts and the rivets and all the nuts and bolts on it. Like, that's something that we put together. And if it's a triangle, it's a human craft. It's not an alien craft. But now he's sort of saying like, well, they're basically indistinguishable from one another. We've got these advanced technologies. We've been hiding them. We've got limitless energy. These are paramilitary groups that have gone rogue. A lot of the same, topics he likes to trot out over the years. They're still his go-tos. But interesting that he's going out of his way in this interview to talk heavily about those kinds of sightings, that these are, he talked about the Tic Tac, for example, that was a Lockheed Martin craft, that he told David Fravor that it was made by Lockheed. This falls squarely into the alternate history category of the 20th century that we don't know. And, he's incredibly confident. That's the thing that I think that is harder for me to evaluate. His confidence in these claims is off the charts. I mean, the guy is incredibly certain that what he is saying is in fact true. But we can get into this in a little bit. Some of the claims which he makes, in my opinion, don't hold up very well to further scrutiny. So that then makes me wonder, well, how valid are some of the things that he's claiming to be true? So that there's a bit of a poison pill here with Steven Greer that I think you have to wrestle with, and it makes discerning the truth from the fiction very difficult.
Absolutely. And I agree with you that there are times where he seems to say things that are almost demonstrably false. And that definitely makes you question how much he vets his own information, how much he believes his own hype. These are questions that arise, but at the same time, again, arguing for nuance here, I don't think we should take those moments and therefore conclude, I'm whitewashing the whole thing. I can't trust anything he says. The world just isn't structured that way. People are not built that way. Everybody has bias, prejudice. We've talked about this. Some are more self-aware than others. But this notion that you have these pearly white, trustworthy sources and these Darth Vader sources that are uttering nothing but untruths deliberately, the world's just more complex than that. And Greer is certainly a complex figure, and we have to just do more homework than that. We have to try to corroborate this. When he brought up the point you made about David Fravor and him telling them that the Tic Tacs were actually ours, and he seemed to suggest that David Fravor's come around now that he knows this. I would love to hear David Fravor mention that and talk about that conversation. How much was he convinced? Because when he testified before Congress, he certainly gave the impression that there's no way that was ours. In fact, he's gone so far as to say, we didn't have that technology in 2004. We don't have that technology in 2025, right? Or 2024, whenever he said that. So again, does that really jive together? All right, the next thing that comes up here is, again, another linchpin of Greer's perspective. This comes up a lot. I think this one's going to be problematic for both of us because we're not seeing the evidence to really support this notion, and it is central to his perspective. And that is around this false flag invasion. So he basically is saying that this deeply underground rogue operation, which is transnational. He talked about you can erase the border between the US and Canada, between these different countries. This is a transnational operation that works with impunity and can basically touch and influence all of these governments, but is untouchable themselves and has technology that is so beyond that any kind of conventional war against them we would lose. It's going to take something else to make this resolvable for us as a humankind. He also seems to suggest that time's running short. We've heard from him recently, and he definitely stressed this with Jesse Michaels, saying that I'm not sure that we have 5 years. And so what I took him to mean is not that we might collapse the earth ourselves in 5 years, although maybe he also believes that, but that this false flag operation is already well underway. They are building the foundations to lay out that argument, and that he thinks that because they have really convincing technology, humankind will go along with it. And because people think it's alien and it's malevolent, they'll surrender their rights in order to have protection. So just to give a couple of examples. So he said that Raytheon has tested holographic UFO projections in the desert, tech that could simulate a staged alien invasion. In other words, people look up, they see a sky full of crap, but they're actually holograms, is his notion. And he also warned that German rocketry father, Werner von Braun, predicted this decades ago, that he knew about this. And I think his secretary later on testified as one of Greer's witnesses in the Disclosure Project. And that psychological operations are already in motion. In fact, he went so far as to say that figures like Lou Elizondo are releasing some truth with some mistruth and are all part of this staged presentation of malevolent non-human intelligence that's a threat to humanity. And this is all set up so that this rogue group can really take over the planet and rule by fear, basically. So with all that said, and I want to get to in a second something he quoted from Jacques Vallée. I'll quote that in a second because it's relevant to this. But initially, your take on this linchpin of his argument that there's a false flag invasion underway. Do you think that's legitimate? Do you think that's believable? Do you see evidence supporting that notion?
I mean, the things that he cites to support that claim, in my opinion, aren't holding up to scrutiny. So a lot of the claims he makes are about, Elizondo beating a threat narrative. And there's a whole host of characters, quite frankly, that he lumps into that cabal group, that intelligence community group. So it's Elizondo and it's Puthoff, even Jacques Vallée at one point. It's Jim Semivan. And a lot of these people who are, kind of the big voices in the conversation have been co-opted by this dark group. And he would make a statement to the effect of, well, they knew how to get to them, and they made them offers, and now they're part of the party line. They're doing this threat narrative, and he also made this claim that they were part of kind of like an eschatological cult. This return of the Messiah of Christ. That they're, this all fits into this plan to usher in the end of the world, and that's the reason that they're backing this threat conception. But if you really look at the claims that, and I've interviewed some of these folks, if they're making that kind of claim, they're not making it strongly enough. I don't hear Chris Mellon or Lou Elizondo going out of their way to say that whatever this is clearly going to come and invade and take over human civilization, and it's going to be the end of the world unless we arm ourselves to the teeth and do something about it. Right? I've never heard that claim. What I have heard is people who are within a military community, and they're coming at this problem from that framework. They're coming at it from, we don't know what it does. We understand it has certain capabilities. And just on my observation and my training, I have to look at those capabilities as a potential threat. There's a big difference between it is a threat and it is a potential threat. And I think that this serves, by Steven Greer really driving home this point over and over again, it just serves his narrative. And that narrative is that ETs are basically good. ETs are benevolent, that, maybe there are some bad ones, but they're not even allowed to get close to us because they're quarantined off from the rest of the universe until they mature. He talked about interdimensional beings, which I actually hadn't really heard him talk about much before. And he was, I think, giving a little nuance to those beings, that they could be perhaps a little mischievous or, bad, but more than often than not, these are love and light beings. They're here to, help us transcend to the next level of our societal evolution, and they could do no wrong. And the government is the big bad, or maybe not the government, but the shadow government is the big bad. The elites, all this secret collusion that goes back, many, many decades. Like they're the bad guys. So I have a hard time buying that based on just my own observations, my own engagement with these individuals. I'm not getting that vibe from them at all.
Agreed. And actually, Elizondo has said repeatedly that when we evaluate threats, potential threats, there are two elements we have to be aware of: capability and intent. And he has said repeatedly, and I think you've heard this many times too, that they have the capability, but we're unclear on intent. So that doesn't, again, sound, I agree with you, like someone who's trying to make the argument that we know that they're malevolent, they're nefarious. I don't even see a slow ramping up of that narrative, that maybe they would design to look more organic. I don't see that whatsoever. And so I just don't see evidence for this claim. And I think he would serve himself better, I think, if he backed off from this. But he seems to double down on this more and more and more. And again, we think about how this impacts the entire way he sees the entire UFO phenomenon, because this also goes into the idea of abductions, right? So you touched on how he basically says all ETs are good. Again, I've raised the question, how could you possibly know that with the size of the universe, the many, many kinds? How can you make such an absolute statement? It seems to even fly in the face of the notion that we advance through stages of consciousness. They would have that happen too. This notion of this kind of cosmic police force that makes sure that they stay quarantined is possible. But again, there are other sources that suggest that there have been holes in that fabric, that fabric might exist. There might be a kind of quarantine in place, but sometimes things sneak in and things do happen that seem to be nefarious. They're not the majority, but they seem to be happening. Of course, what he would say is that those things that are happening, anything that seems negative, while, like you said, he did acknowledge that perhaps some interdimensional beings can be negative or malevolent, and he didn't really go into much definition of why he believes that, why he picks that particular kind. But what he does say pretty clearly and with bold confidence is that abductions altogether are an operation of the same enterprise. And this relates to something that he brought up in the podcast with Jesse around something that Jacques Vallée talked about, a document that Jacques had. So I wanted to read that section. This is from Forbidden Science, one of the journals of Jacques Vallée. And this was Thursday, March 26, 1992. He said, quote, "I have secured a document confirming that the CIA simulated UFO abductions in Latin America, Brazil and Argentina specifically, as psychological warfare experiments. On Tuesday, aerospace researcher Morvin Saliz met me in Burbank. I gave him the Flex Image digital tapes of the Costa Rica photographs before going to dinner in Hollywood with Bob Weiss and Tracy." So Greer points to this document to suggest that we not only believe this to be the case, but we have evidence, and that Jacques Vallée has documents attesting to this fact that the CIA, different rogue groups, have actually been involved in staging these abductions. Want to get your take on that, how you think that changes or not your perspective on abductions. How legitimate do you think that explanation is to explain the broad assortment of this entire abduction phenomenon and how that relates to hybridization and all of that?
Yeah, it's certainly interesting. Yeah, I think the issue I have here, and this is the issue I have with Greer just more broadly, is that he's the one talking, he's the one making the claims. Everybody else is not, doesn't know what they're talking about, or they're part of the cabal. Every other seemingly legitimate voice that has come forward to talk about this subject is not to be trusted. You can only trust Steven Greer. And that's, so think about all the people that he's lumped into that counter group. He's lumped in, the folks we just talked about. He's lumped in John Mack, for example, that John Mack got co-opted, and that, he was given these abduction stories and they were, spun to be negative, and that's government related. Basically Danny Sheehan, who used to be literally part of the Disclosure Project. He was the chief counsel for Steven Greer's Disclosure Project back in 2001. And he said, Steven Greer's now been co-opted. So When you get that kind of behavior and you hear that from him over and over and over again, that basically he's the guy with the answers, everybody else is not accurate in what they're saying, and they're all part of the problem. That's where the red flags go up for me. And so I much more lean to what David Grush has said. And this is where it gets, again, further confusing and contradictory. He leans pretty heavily on Grush in this interview, talks very highly of Grush, talks about, that they have a relationship, and he's, come to talk to Steven. Steven's talked to David. And David, of course, as we all know, has divulged that there have been agreements between these groups and human groups. There have been some sort of agreements for technological transfer or something. And for whatever reason, among those agreements cannot be any room for that these ETs might be doing some of the abducting. Like only the abducting is happening by the humans. So again, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny. I have a lot of questions about his judgment. And if you look at what's easier to manipulate from a disinformation standpoint, is it one person or is it many, many people? Like how easy is it to manipulate one person with the kind of personality that this individual has versus dozens of people all coming out, not necessarily knowing each other, but coming out and sharing their testimony and corroborating other elements of the phenomena that are in contradiction to claims that this one person makes? That raises a lot of red flags for me. So yeah, I don't necessarily give a lot of credence to this CIA simulating UFO abductions. Could they be involved with them? Absolutely. Could there be factions within that agency that have been involved with them? Absolutely. But to be purely and solely responsible for them, I just don't buy it.
Right, and we think here about the term MILABs, military abductions, how this relates to this. My issue here is one of scope and scale. So I don't doubt, like you said and acknowledged, that there have been staged abductions. I have no doubt that they would try this both to be able to gain information from abductees. So in other words, if abductees have been in the presence of these beings, then they might know things that the government would want to know. So I could imagine them staging these things, perhaps even using drugs on top of that to confuse people and make them more likely to talk about what they'd experienced. So it could be an intelligence gathering technique. I have no doubt that that has happened. I think it's likely that's happened. There are people who have described that to me, people who both have one kind of experience they remember, which is of one sort, and another kind of experience, which is a different sort altogether, that they recognize qualitatively as different. One seems to be government-led, the other one seems to be led by NHI. Now, again, it gets complicated here because sometimes NHI involves human beings that are not Earth human beings as far as we understand. So again, these divisions, these clear lines kind of get destroyed, obliterated by this phenomenon. But the point is that the government does seem to be able to track who the experiencers are, who the abductees are. And because of that, it doesn't surprise me that they would target some of these individuals to try to find more information out. And they might do that through the means of a false abduction scenario. But when we think about the scope and the scale of abductions, I think about how John Mack went to Africa and spoke to shamans who talked about abductions with the Mantindine, the Greys that they understood, that's the word they had for them, going back generations and generations, way before the CIA even existed, right? So this is the issue, is that it just doesn't hold when you think about the scope and the scale, the tens of thousands of people this has happened to. And of course, because of screen memories and whatnot, it might have happened to many more people than we're aware of. But it just doesn't seem to square. And again, he seems to be committed to ideas, and then no amount of evidence will persuade him otherwise. That's one of the least credible claims I think he makes from my perspective. And I also want to add that abduction doesn't equal malevolent. I have many friends who are part of the abduction phenomenon. They have relational dynamics with these beings now. They volunteered to be part of the hybridization campaign once they understood what the purpose of it was. So he'd have to explain that too. And so, yeah, it just doesn't add up. I don't think abductions equals malevolence. And I just don't think it fits with the scale of the operation, that this would actually be a human-led or CIA-driven kind of operation. All right, so in the interest of time, turning to the end here, really quickly, I want to get your take on something else he discussed that I think is something that really impacts all of us. And something that he champions is a spirit that I think we would join him in. And that is wanting to see humankind 2.0 raise up out of this movement. That he talked about suppressed free energy, for instance, and how that could liberate every poor person, every person that's in abject poverty around the world, could finally undo the control structures of the elite groups that have controlled us up until now. So let's end here. His takes on consciousness, the consciousness evolution that's on the table, which I agree with him on, and how free energy would play a role in that.
Well, I can get behind that 100%. I think that we do need a transformation of our hearts, of our minds, the ways in which we have been conducting ourselves to date obviously have led to tremendous advancements for human society, health, wellness, all of those kinds of things. But can we do more? Can we do better? Absolutely. Are we living in harmony with the planet that we call home? No. So are there lessons to be learned from either higher intelligence, non-human intelligence, whatever you want to call it? I think the answer is yes. And I think our traditions, our religious traditions have alluded to this. So taking UFOs out of the equation entirely, our spiritual traditions have alluded to this reality. And I think our lived experience, every human being's lived experience, really does hint at this being true as well, that you don't need an experience of a UFO or an abduction or an entity encounter to conclude that something is out of alignment in our world. And to hope for better alignment is a goal worth supporting. Now, we can differ over the means by which we might try to achieve that and the reasons why we are striving for that. But to strive for that at all is a worthy cause, and I very much support him in that endeavor. But I want to say, and the last I'll say about it is, I do judge a person by their behavior. And the behavior that I have observed of Steven Greer seems to conflict with the rhetoric of Steven Greer in this particular area. So he's a person that is espousing this kind of human brotherhood and love and light and evolution, free energy and advancement. But his behavior, and I think comes through in some degree in this interview, is a little bit off-putting with those professed values. So I have to square that somehow to make sense of that. Obviously, we're all flawed, and there's no perfect person who's going to be striving for enlightenment, right? That's not how it works. But I am a little bit alarmed at, I think, the gap between his behavior and his rhetoric in this particular area. But I do fully support that we need to strive in that direction.
Yeah, agreed. And I do think we should look at people's behavior. And as I like to say, people eventually tell on themselves with their behavior. This relates to something I talked about at Archives, my presentation there, because I very much do agree with him that actually the cosmic default is a sense of oneness. And this illusion of separation is at the heart of all of our problems. And I agree with Greer that we're reaching this bottleneck that if we don't figure this out, we're not going to make this passage. And this speaks to something I talked about in my presentation, which is this notion of a meta-crisis, which is multiple compounding crises happening simultaneously. But the undercurrent of that is basically a meaning-making crisis. So when we don't know how to make meaning anymore, we end up seeing these pathologies arise in our world involving ecological collapse, mental health problems, economic inequality and instability, which Greer spoke a lot about, and socio-political polarization. All of those arise in this meta-crisis, and these form what's called a polycrisis, which is a term to describe a situation where multiple crises occur simultaneously and their interactions compound the overall impact, making the whole much more dangerous or destabilizing than the individual parts. That's where we are. He's right. I want to champion that aspect, not so much the part about this false flag invasion, but the fact that we ourselves are the threat to ourselves. And at the root of that is this illusion of separation. So I very much champion that. I do agree with him that many of the ET species have that perspective already. I think this is the default perspective of splinters of source consciousness, which we all are. And we are at a unique time where I agree with him that civilizations like ours, we've heard this from other places in the lore, tend to either extinguish themselves, blow themselves up at this point because they don't get it, or they have some sort of awakening. And from that, they arise to something like a 2.0 version of that species. We have both those options on the table. I certainly hope we choose the one where there's an awakening. And I will say, if nothing else, then the pressures we're feeling can help, in the same way that a diamond is formed, create that impetus for awakening. I see that happening too. And I want to stand alongside him there, even if I disagree with some things, and saying, yes, absolutely, this is the perspective we need.
Well said. And it's important, I think, as you emphasize there, to do so in community, right? We're really, I think, at our best when we try to work together, we try to put our differences aside, and we try to move forward in a positive direction as a collective. We're not, I think, as good at that as we should be, and I'm hoping that we will get better at that we will rise to our better nature in the coming months and years ahead. There are a lot of challenges in front of us right now at this time, as we've talked about many times on our show. It's certainly not a calm, peaceful world at the moment, but within that chaos, there are opportunities for being present, being authentic, encouraging community, encouraging love and respect. And, we all have a responsibility to act where we are and to try to bring that kind of world into reality. And I hope that we can do that, even if it may not be perfect. Striving for it is worthwhile. And this has been a really interesting conversation, and a lot of great things that have been taking place. There's a lot of churn, I think, in the topic right now. There's a lot of different avenues of investigation, of evidence that we're seeing, a lot of things that are kind of percolating, if you will, and we're really going to see what does rise to the top over the next few weeks. I'm going to be paying very close attention, as I know you are always. And listeners, thanks so much for joining us. Please do leave us some feedback and questions, comments. We're always happy to get those and kind of see where you are, where we might want to take the conversation going forward. On that note, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery, and may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Phames.